Hello everybody and welcome to STEM Unlocked. Today we're going to be talking about Hardy-Weinberg. So what is the Hardy-Weinberg principle? The Hardy-Weinberg principle is a mathematical model used to study how genes behave in a population over time. Imagine a population of rabbits. Some of these rabbits have white fur and some of these rabbits have gray fur. The Hardy-Weinberg principle helps us figure out if these fur colors stay the same across generations or if they change over time due to evolution. There are 5 conditions that must be true before scientists are allowed to use Hardy-Weinberg to accurately determine a population's genetic makeup. The first condition is that no mutations are allowed to occur. This is to ensure that no new genotypes are introduced to the population, affecting scientists' ability to accurately determine whether the population is evolving in favoring one genotype over the other. The second condition of Hardy-Weinberg is that there is no natural selection, meaning that each individual has an equal chance at survival. This is extremely important because if one genotype is more favorable for survival than another genotype, then naturally the genotypes with the favorable genotype will survive, but the ones without the favorable genotype will die out, which is why it's very important that no natural selection happens so that scientists can ensure that it remains as accurate as possible to determine whether evolution is occurring or not. The third condition of Hardy-Weinberg is random mating. This means that mating pairs must not be chosen based off of other factors like, oh, you have this condition and I have this condition, so let's have babies so our kids will have this condition. No, random mating means that it's truly random so that there is no chance that one genotype will stay dominant over another just because of this. The fourth condition is that there's no gene flow, meaning that nobody is migrating outside the population as nobody is immigrating inside the population. This is to ensure that no genotypes are exiting the population, causing a drift, and that no genotypes are being introduced to the population, potentially causing a drift. The fifth and final condition of Hardy-Weinberg is a large population size to avoid genetic drift. This is important because if we have a smaller population size, we might have more of a recessive genotype than a dominant genotype. However, with a larger population size, we can ensure that we're able to truly see which genotype is more favorable for these species and what they're naturally evolving to if they are evolving. Before we talk about the Hardy-Weinberg equations, there's some basic vocabulary we need to know. One of these terms is an allele. The definition of an allele is a version of a gene. An example of this, let's say that a big B allele codes for brown eyes and a little b allele codes for blue eyes. This is a version of a gene and will lead to certain traits. The second term is a genotype. You've heard me say this word a lot in this video, but what does genotype actually mean? Genotype is a combination of the two alleles, the version of a gene you have. There are 3 different possible genotypes. There's a homozygous dominant genotype, a heterozygous genotype, and a homozygous recessive genotype. If you have a homozygous dominant genotype, you only have a dominant allele. So let's use the last example, where big B coded for brown eyes. If you have 2 big B alleles, you will only have a dominant allele, and therefore you will display the dominant trait. The second possible genotype is a heterozygous genotype. A heterozygous genotype means you have 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. An example of this is big B little b. And even though you have both alleles, you will display the dominant trait. And the last possible genotype is homozygous recessive, which means you only have the recessive allele. An example of this is little b, and in this scenario, you will display the recessive trait. If you are homozygous dominant, no matter what, you will pass down a dominant allele to your offspring. If you are heterozygous, you have a 50-50% chance of passing either the dominant allele or the recessive allele to your offspring. And if you are homozygous recessive, you will pass a recessive allele to your offspring. Now that we've covered some basic terms, let's talk about the two Hardy-Weinberg equations. The first equation is the allele frequency equation, which is P plus Q equals 1. P is the frequency of the dominant allele as a decimal, and Q is the frequency of a recessive allele as a decimal. These are both the percentages of the frequency of the allele written in a decimal form. P and Q will add up to a whole number 1, which represents 100% of the population. So for example, if 68% of the population has a dominant allele, I would write P as 0.68, and then I could solve for Q, which is the recessive allele frequency. The second equation is the genotype frequency equation, which is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. P squared represents the percentage of the population that is homozygous dominant as a decimal. 2PQ represents the percentage of the population that is heterozygous as a decimal, and Q squared represents the percentage of the population that is homozygous recessive as a decimal. Now that we've learned about the equation for Hardy-Weinberg, the allele frequency equation, and the genotype frequency equation, let's now do a practice problem. In a population of 1,000 people, 160 of them have a recessive condition. If we assume Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, what are the allele frequencies of the dominant and recessive allele? So we know that the total population is 1,000 people, and that 160 have a recessive condition. When we're told to assume Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, this means that the 5 conditions must be true. Now the problem is asking us to find the allele frequency of both the dominant and the recessive allele. So let's say that big A is our dominant allele. And that little a is our recessive allele. We know that 160 people have a recessive condition, and in order to have a recessive condition, you need to have a little a. This means that 160 people are homozygous recessive. So if 160 people are homozygous recessive, then we know based on the genotype frequency equation that Q squared is equal to 106 P squared. P squared is equal to 160. And we know it's out of 1,000 people. So what we'll do is we will do 160 divided by 1,000 in order to get the percentage of people as a decimal who are homozygous recessive and have this condition. So when we do the math, we get 0.16. Now this is P squared. So P squared equals 0.16. but the allele frequency equation is P plus Q equals 1. So we have P squared, but we want to find out what P is. So what we'll do is we'll take the square root of both sides, and when we do that, we get P is equal to 0.4. So when we sub this back into our equation, we get 0.4 plus Q is equal to 1. So you just do basic algebra, and then you get Q is equal to 0.6. So let's put this in percentage form. P is 0.4, and that's equal to 40%. And Q is 0.6, which is equal to 60%. So P, the recessive allele, has a 40% frequency. And the dominant allele frequency is at 60%. Now let's move on to the next problem. Using the previous problem, figure out what percentage of the population is homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So as we remember from the last problem, big A is the dominant allele, and little a is the recessive allele. We know from earlier in the video when I defined these terms, homozygous dominant means you only have the dominant allele. This would mean big A equals homozygous dominant. We know that heterozygous is when you have the recessive allele and the dominant allele. So that's big A and little a. And we know that homozygous recessive is when you only have the recessive allele, which is little a. Looking back on the previous problem, we know that the frequency of P, your dominant allele, is equal to 0.6, and that the frequency of Q, the recessive allele, is equal to 0.4. Now, let's use the genotype frequency equation to figure out the percentage of the population that's homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. As I stated earlier in the video, the genotype frequency equation is 2p squared plus 2pq. It's p squared plus 2pq plus q squared is equal to 1. We know that p is equal to 0.6. And so in order to sub it into our equation, we will do p equals 0.6, and we want to square both sides so that we can get p squared. P squared will then equal to 0.36. So we're going to sub that into our equation right here, 0.36 plus, then we know that we already have P and Q from the previous problem. We know that P is equal to 0.6, and we know that Q is equal to 0.4. Now for our last number in our equation, we want to get Q squared. So in order to get Q squared, you're going to do Q equals 0.4, and you're going to square both sides. So Q will equal to 0.16 Q squared. And you'll sub that into our equation over here and have this equal 1. Now when we do the math, we know that this portion of the equation represents the percentage of the population that's homozygous dominant. We know that this portion of the equation represents the percentage of the population that's heterozygous. And we know that this portion of the equation represents the part of the population that's homozygous recessive. Now let's put it in decimal form. So if 0.36% is equal to P squared, which is the population that's homozygous dominant, 0.36 as a decimal, so you just multiply it by 100 and you get 36% of the population is homozygous dominant. Then we know that 2 times 0.6 times 0.4 is the percentage of the population that's heterozygous. So you do 2 times 0.6 times 0.4, which is then equal to 0.48. You multiply this by 100, and then you get that 48% of the population is heterozygous. And lastly, we know that the last part of the equation, 0.16, represents the percentage of the population that is homozygous recessive. So you multiply this by 100 to put it as a percentage, and you get that 16% of the population is homozygous recessive. And that's Hardy-Weinberg. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Feel free to like and share if you found this video helpful, comment future video ideas and feedback or praise, and subscribe if you'd like. Thank you so much.